Almost exactly 2 years after the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump's most ardent fans still like to break out into raucous chants of "lock her up," as they did Tuesday night in Mississippi. It's a chant, you'll remember, that originated as a call to jail Trump's political opponent, even though the FBI declined to prosecute her after a long investigation. And were it not so galling, it would be darkly comedic that in the very same rally where Trumpists chanted "lock her up," the president defended the principle of the presumption of innocence.
Guilty until proven innocent. That's very dangerous for our country. That's very dangerous for our country.
All right, so let's talk about the presumption of innocence and the consequences of allegations of wrongdoing for the most powerful man in the world. The president has been accused by at least 15 women on the record of unwanted sexual contact, all of which he says are false. He faced no legal or criminal liability for it whatsoever. Just 2 days ago, he was accused in a detailed, documented investigation by the New York Times of participating in decades of what they said was outright fraud in evading taxes while receiving the equivalent of at least $413 million from his father's real estate empire. And he has faced neither legal nor criminal consequences, which is really par for the course. Thanks in part to the repeated slashing of the IRS budget since the Gingrich era, tax fraud and money hiding regularly go unpunished. It takes a special case to face prosecution. Just ask Paul Manafort, who surely would have gotten away with his own flagrant crimes had he not found himself in Robert Mueller's sights. And it's not just the president who has skated past accountability in the Trump White House. His former staff secretary, Rob Porter, was accused of abuse by 2 separate ex-wives, including one who provided this photo of a black eye she says he gave her. Yet even after those abuse claims, which Porter denies, were brought to the attention of the White House, Porter was allowed to continue in his job at the White House, handling the most sensitive documents in the nation. He only lost his job after it all became public, and he has faced no other consequences. And then there's Brett Kavanaugh, who's been accused by Christine Blasey Ford under oath of sexual assault, which he denies. Dr. Blasey Ford has been described as credible by Republican senators and even the president himself, while many of Kavanaugh's former classmates say he blatantly lied under oath in playing down his youthful drinking and explaining away his adolescent inside jokes. But Kavanaugh hasn't faced any legal or criminal consequences either. In fact, he is now poised to get a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. And that speaks to the difference between how the presumption of innocence works for people like Trump and Kavanaugh and the lived reality of millions of Americans. Every single day, thousands upon thousands of our fellow citizens are run through America's criminal courts. They are disproportionately poor and non-white, and the presumption of their guilt is the basic operating principle that keeps the whole system running, in guilty plea after guilty plea after guilty plea. Right now, as I speak to you, there are hundreds of thousands of Americans in jail simply because they cannot afford to pay their bail. They are presumed innocent by the law and Constitution and locked in cages nonetheless. Khalif Browder was one of them. He spent 3 years in Rikers because he was accused of stealing a backpack at the age of 16. While inside, he was beaten by a guard, attacked by fellow inmates, and put in solitary confinement for 2 years. When he got out, he killed himself. Judge Kavanaugh has suggested the accusation that he is facing has destroyed his life. And I would urge him to talk to Browder's relatives and Browder's loved ones about what that phrase really means. For most of human history, the law has largely functioned as another means to protect those in power and punish those without. And if there's a single shining principle of this nation worth fighting every last inch for, it is the words above the Supreme Court: equal justice under law. That phrase represents a repudiation of the banal tyranny under which humans have struggled for most of our lives on the planet. It may not be a reality, but it should be the North Star towards which we still struggle. And if there is a single principle that Donald Trump stands for, made manifest time and again in his attacks on Robert Mueller, his dismissal of accounts of his wrongdoing, and his defenses of other powerful men, it is the principle of power over law. The idea that the law is for the little people, for the wrongly accused Central Park Five, who he called to have executed, and the Khalif Browders, and the Central American mothers risking life and limb to bring their children out of harm's way. They get the law. He and his friends, they get due process and the presumption of innocence. Next week, Brett Kavanaugh may well go to start his powerful new job and walk up those steps, the Supreme Court, under the words equal justice under law. And I wonder if he will know, somewhere deep down, that the man who appointed him and the political coalition to which he owes his job have turned that phrase into just another cruel. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.